So hello, everybody. My name is Dennis Cao. I'm from Carleton University School of Social Work. I'm on the faculty there. I also run the undergraduate program, the BSW, Bachelor's of Social Work program there. And joining me is my co-author on this paper, Eiman Sultan, who is a recent BSW alumni and currently works for the Ottawa Carleton School Board. And we're going to be presenting a paper that highlights some preliminary results. We're still kind of digging into the data, but the title of our paper is Exploring Anti-Asian Racism in the Canadian Twitterverse During COVID. And we plan to keep this fairly informal. Eiman and I are kind of we're going to go back and forth during the presentation. And I know that there's Q&A afterwards, but feel free if you have any questions, at any point in time, let us know as well. All right. So this paper is based on a component of a broader project that we've been conducting here at Carleton University that's been funded by the Carleton COVID Rapid Response Grant, which gave us a little bit of money to start this. And then we're looking for other funding sources. The objectives are really to look at the racial discrimination experiences impacting Asian Canadians, but specifically looking at the health and well-being, its impact on the health and well-being. As social workers, we're very concerned about the social determinants of health and mental health, and racial discrimination obviously is a key factor, especially during the past year. And we're very interested in the health and well-being of Asian Canadians. And so this has several components. Social media is one of those components, and we'll be focusing on just a snippet of the social media part. We're also analyzing news media. And so we've been compiling news media since everything started last year or even prior to that. And we've been collecting news media. We're going to look at kind of how the media has been covering this issue. We're also doing some secondary data analysis of some data sets through StatsCan. I'm originally from the United States, and so I'm also looking at some data sets in the United States and doing some comparative analysis between the US and Canada. And then finally, the original plan was to conduct an online survey that's been put on hold because of everything that's been going on. And we found some interesting data to look at from a secondary data perspective. And so we put that on hold, but that's eventually in the works. And hopefully we'll be able to dig deeper into the health and well-being in terms of certain indicators like depression, anxiety, and things like that. So this paper, we'll be focusing on the response among Canadians to the rise and the extent of anti-Asian racism on Twitter specifically, Twitter being one of the more popular social media outlets out there. Sorry, okay. So let me just give you a quick background. Racism isn't new, obviously, but it may be exacerbated or even normalized during difficult times. We saw a little bit of this during SARS, and then definitely this past year with the COVID pandemic. But we see this across a lot of, this impacting a lot of racialized groups, including during times of recession, during times of war. We've also seen it historically as well. So racism isn't new. And the research is very clear that it has a very negative effect on one's health and well-being. I should note that there is limited research on Asian Canadians specifically, though. And racism and discrimination, of course, as we all know, as we've been discussing throughout this week, can occur in a number of different forms, overt or subtle, ranging from hate incidences to microaggressions. And the theoretical framework for our entire study really is this minority stress theory, which Myers first postulated focusing on the LGBT population, but has since the literature and the research has expanded the application of the minority source theory to other racialized and other minority groups. And the whole essence of this is that as minorities, minorities generally face external stressors that are very specific and unique to each group. And these stressors place a lot of stress on us, on minority groups and different minority groups. And as a consequence, that has an impact on the mental health and health of these groups. Maybe first impacting the mental health, for example, in terms of increased anxiety, higher levels of stress, of course, which then ultimately could lead to other more serious mental health outcomes, for example, depression. And then ultimately, we understand from the research that there is a significant relationship between mental health and health. And for those who are suffering from mental health, some of those ailments may start to come out as physical health outcomes. And we've seen that in the research. One thing I want to kind of touch upon is this whole notion of hostile environment. And I'll use kind of the news media that we've been kind of collecting over the past year. And so these are just little headlines from the various news reports throughout this past year. And of course, these attacks on individuals, has a serious impact on the individual victim as well as their broader family. But in terms of the hostile environment, I would argue, and this is kind of our conceptual framework, is that by reading these news articles and reading increased reports of these things happen, it creates a chilling effect on those of us who weren't direct victims, but it creates a chilling effect on us because we are part of that community as well. And so as a consequence of this, and as a consequence of this hostile environment, we experience increased stress. We experience higher levels of anxiety. We also feel more fearful and anxious about going out to the supermarket and things like that. And our levels of vigilance also increase as well. And so that's our look at Twitter data. Obviously, the Twitter data is very limited. We can't get information about the health and well-being of Twitter users. But based on this conceptual framework, racist tweets, for example, we would contend that they create a chilling effect on other Twitter users who may or may not be the direct recipient of these posts. So racism in the social media space, between December 2019 and March 2020, there was a 900% increase in hate speech on Twitter towards China and Chinese. We would contend that the impact of racism and discrimination in the social media space is still not fully understood. And that's kind of part of why we're trying to look at this. But we would also contend, based on our conceptual framework, that racist and discriminatory posts on the social media platform may also have a negative effect on the users, regardless of whether or not they're direct recipients. And Twitter is kind of this interesting space, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about kind of the complexity of it. But one thing that is, maybe different than incidences that occur, like hate incidents that occur, and then our news reports about Twitter. Once something's in Twitter, it kind of stays there, right? And so there's kind of a more frequency, or eventually it'll get to a broader group of people, just because once something is out in Twitter, it kind of stays there. One thing that we're starting to look at and kind of think about is this whole notion of bystander effect in the social media space. And we know from the research that bystanders can have a positive effect on individuals who are target of discrimination. So someone who is a victim of discrimination and a bystander steps in, research has shown that can have a positive effect. And so we're wondering, so does this play out the same way in the social media space? Does seeing other users push back on racist and hateful posts, does that have a buffering effect? Does that have an opposite effect than the chilling effect? that the original racist post might have. And in Twitter, because people tend to be a little more anonymous and can kind of mask their identities, maybe it could be a little easier to respond to racism in the Twitter space. This is a very crude, really quickly put together conceptual framework diagram. So I apologize. Let me just kind of walk through, just to kind of confirm, confirm kind of what we've been just trying to talk about previously. And so it starts with the original tweet, and it obviously oftentimes tweets are directed or in response to another tweet, but there's usually a recipient, a key recipient of that tweet. And then that tweet could have an effect in some way, right? And let's say if it's a racist tweet, I would contend it has a negative effect on that recipient, and then potentially their health and well-being in terms of increased stress, etc. And then their I'm forgetting what they're called, their followers, or in the Facebook context, their friends, because they also might indirectly receive that tweet or see that tweet. So user 4, user 5, user 6, they in turn might be affected. But then because it's out there in the Twitter space, there's a broader environment where the tweet might, have a chilling effect on other users that may or may not be connected to the recipient in one way, in any way. User 9, the green circle, is just my way of notating, oh, what if somebody pushes back on that tweet? Does that have an opposite effect? If the recipient sees somebody pushing back in response, in support of the recipient or the victim or the recipient of that tweet, does that have a buffering effect? Does that impact? And so those are some of the things we're trying to conceptualize. Obviously, it's going to take a lot more than just collecting Twitter data and analyzing Twitter data to see if this is truly happening. But this is kind of our broad conceptual framework that we're working on right now.
So for the methods sections, we have been collecting Twitter data since July 2020 using the tags application, which is a Google Doc-based application. We have used a mix of keywords that consist of race, ethnicity, COVID-related, and ethnic slurs that have been used in our Twitter data search. So for this paper, we collected data for a 2-week period, 2 weeks before the Atlanta shooting and 2 weeks after, to observe the Twitter space in a Canadian context. So raw data was collected using random sampling on Twitter, using keywords and themes of the study. Data was then collected once a week for a 7-day period, every Monday, for the period of March 8th, March 15th, March 22nd, and March 29th. The significance of these dates is to observe the Twitter space in relation to the Atlanta shooting that occurred on March 16th. After the raw data was collected, we then began to analyze, to clean the data. So cleaning the data is basically looking at only Canada-based tweets, which is the target population of our study, English-speaking Canadians to be specific. The data is then stored using a Google Drive application and is pasted onto an Excel sheet. We then begin to analyze the alphanumeric tweets for relevant themes, relationships, comparisons, and keywords using Deduce, data analysis software, to analyze our data. Once we analyzed our data and came up with our findings, we discovered several key themes. The key themes are positive support for fellow Canadians, information sharing, Twitter as a place to share one's story, and a call to action. And I will discuss the themes further. So theme 1, an example of this is theme 1, positive support towards fellow Canadians. An example of this is the tweet, "The continuous racism towards Asian people across the world has left me in despair. People are using COVID-19 as a disgusting excuse to fuel their hate against Asians." So when we see tweets like this emerge and the retweets, the data shows that there's a significant positive response and that Canadians are retweeting these Asian experiences. It shows solidarity and shows there is pushback as well as a bystander effect amongst Canadians in the Twitter space. The bystander effect takes place when users share, like, and retweet these experiences. Theme number 2, information sharing. So an example of this is a reminder that the spike in violence against Asian people during COVID is rooted in part in a long history of framing Chinese people as inherently diseased and unhygienic. Twitter was used as an information sharing environment. Tweets were posted that spoke in response to historical and systematic misrepresentations of people of Asian and Chinese descent. And many of these posts came from broader organizations. Many retweets occurred to shed light on the increase in heightened level of violence in Canada. Theme number 3, a place to share one story. An example of this is, these days I often think I should be careful going outside, and I don't think that because of the virus. I think that because of racism. Sometimes we're tolerable, sometimes not, and we have no control over that. So theme number 3 speaks to online spaces and shows that they can provide a safe and empowering environment for people to share their experiences of racism. Storytelling is pushing back and responding to these hateful incidences. It's a way for victims to garner support, and when retweets happen, a supportive environment is fostered. And this is when the online bystanders show their support by liking, supporting, as well as retweeting these experiences, making those victims' voices heard. And lastly, theme number 4, an example of it is the surge in racist acts against people of Asian backgrounds during the pandemic has shocked and saddened our team. And we all need to take action. So it's a call to action. It's when organizations and platforms use Twitter to raise awareness, as well as address the issue. Many statements of a call to action occurred in response to the Atlanta shooting. And we move on to the limitations.
All right. So I think there were a number of limitations. Obviously, we can't look specifically at health and well-being of the users without any follow-up. And so Twitter data obviously is incomplete, and it's a messy too. And so one thing that we found out, it's with all the retweets, with all the likes, with the it's really messy, and it's kind of a messy form of data to kind of filter through. And obviously Twitter data, we focused on English language users. And of course, so Twitter data, it's not representative of all voices, of course. And of course, Twitter, only a certain type of user, type of person uses Twitter regularly. And so it's obviously it's not representative of all voices in that way as well. We were probably looking, we were probably expecting to see a lot more negativity. And I'll talk a little bit about maybe some of the kind of implications of that. Obviously, there's other limitations. So users were identified as Canadians only based on geographic identifiers. And so in most cases, I think most tweets, we were not able to identify where they came from. And it's an option in Twitter. I think it's an opt out, I think. I'm not sure anymore. And so we were only identify Canadian users based on if there was geographic identifiers available. And like I said, information drawn from Twitter data can be limited. So we weren't able to look at health or well-being. And Twitter is obviously just one social media space. There are others that might be more, well, let me go to the next slide and we can talk a little bit about kind of that limitation specifically. So contrary to our expectations, we didn't see the blatant racism or discrimination occurring in the Twitter space, especially during this time, which was March, essentially the month of March. Keep in mind that this was a year, it's been about a year since everything started. And when we were started collecting in July, we saw a lot more negativity. And so one possible explanation for that, we think, is that especially since the beginning of this year, it's possible that Twitter may have become or evolved into a safer place, possibly due to stricter enforcement, maybe the removal of a certain leader, political leader from the Twitter space. And then, as a consequence, people and groups are maybe leaving for other spaces. And so there are other spaces where, would be a lot more open to this type of negativity. Parlor is one example. I think Facebook, because you form groups and you can talk to certain audiences specifically, um, maybe that's a safer place for those who want to for the racism and discrimination to occur. And so as a consequence or as a result, maybe Twitter is a safer place as far as when it comes to uh, and that's why maybe we're seeing the absence of blatant racism and discrimination. Um, but I think, I'm also, somewhat encouraged. I don't know about Iman, but based on kind of what we've seen and observed in the Twitter space over the past year, I'm somewhat also encouraged by kind of the positivity seems to kind of be emerging. The place where people can voice their concerns, the place where, people feel comfortable pushing back on negativity or highlighting kind of the errors in opinions and things like that. And so maybe right now Twitter has kind of evolved maybe into a space that serves multiple purposes, as highlighted by our themes. But I'm somewhat encouraged by the positivity that we saw. Of course, we were expecting a lot more, and I think there was a lot more earlier, especially earlier last year. But we weren't seeing the blatant racism or discrimination that was highlighted in the study that was looking at Twitter at the beginning of last year. So maybe that's a good thing, or maybe it could be due to some of the limitations in our study. Iman, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think you touched all the thoughts I had in mind.
And I think that's it. Thank you.